Andrew Luck, go ahead and enjoy life, man. Hell of a run you had.
You are Locked On Fantasy Basketball, your daily fantasy basketball podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Fantasy Basketball podcast brought to you by Basketball Monster. My name is Josh Lloyd and I am the lead fantasy analyst at basketballmonster.com, and you can find me on Twitter as always at redrock_bball. Today we are doing another team preview podcast. We are doing the Utah Jazz. So Michael Bolton.
Let's get to it.
David Locke is here from, of course, Locked On Jazz, from, of course, Locked On NBA, of course, the radio announcer for the Utah Jazz and the founder of the Locked On Podcast Network. David, you are back to talk Utah Jazz. Welcome back for maybe, the fifth year in a row, I think?
I think so. We've done this for a few years. It's always fun. You do a great job. This is a staple of my preparation. I catch every single one of these, listen to it, keep notes on them. It's one of the main things I use as a play-by-play announcer. I know Doris uses it to get ready for ESPN stuff. So a lot of guys and women in the league use this as your show as a prep piece this time of year. It's much appreciated.
Oh, I appreciate hearing that those you and those guys are using this show. There is a lot for us to talk about with this Jazz team. For a team that was good last year, David, they have made some pretty significant changes in terms of how this squad's going to look this season. But first of all, and I've started all these team preview shows just by catching up on guys who maybe were injured last season and where they're at as we start to head into training camp. And it couldn't be a Utah Jazz program without talking about Dante Exum being injured. Where are we at with Dante at the moment, who's missed more games than he's played probably over the course of his career?
Well, you probably know more than I do, being down under at this point. He bought part of an Australian basketball teams, the most recent thing he's done. There is some optimism that he's on schedule and that he will that he'll be ready to go when training camp starts. I don't know exactly what ready to go is going to mean, but he's been working hard, and there's some optimism that, at least from a health standpoint, he should be fairly close to going. Kind of the last word we got on it was an Eric Woodyard piece about in July, and the feeling then was that things were heading. I haven't heard much more in that regard. The question is going to be what position he's going to play and how they're going to use him, I think, is a little bit of, have they moved past him as a point guard still? He and Emmanuel Mudiay will battle for time. Or maybe is it better for Dante just to move and be a wing player and play off the ball and do some of those kind of things?
He's obviously got the size to play on the wing. He's 6'6", pretty decent wingspan. And they did just bring in Emmanuel Mudiay to, I guess, ostensibly take that backup point guard spot, or at least provide insurance in case Exum can't do it. But I think his best position probably is playing more of the 2-3 and guarding the opposition team's best backcourt player, as we've seen him do in the past with James Harden in those Rockets playoff series. He's not really a guy that's much of a fantasy impact guy. He can sometimes get some steals, and sometimes he shows this real explosive scoring ability, but it's so few and far between that I don't think we're going to be seeing Exum as being too much of an impact guy this season. And coming off another knee injury, it is something we do have to monitor with him over the course of his career. ACL, shoulder injury, and now another knee injury. All this stuff just continues to add up, and maybe it puts a bit of a cap on what his overall potential can be. But a guy who is going to have more of an impact this season, David, is of course the big free agent signing from the Utah Jazz, and that is Boyan Bogdanovich, who some people criticize the Jazz maybe for overpaying Bogdanovich on this contract. What did Utah see in him, and why did they want to go this route? They've been steadfast in playing the Derek Favors, Rudy Gobert front court combination, and to me, bringing in Bogdanovich here sort of signals the end of Quin Snyder. You're really wanting to stick with that too big format and going a little bit more spacey. Is that what the idea was here to take this Jazz team to the next level?
I mean, the Jazz got as many open looks as anyone in the NBA last year, depending on the metrics you look at. During the playoffs, they simply could not hit an open shot. If you look at the team catch and shoot numbers for the NBA last year, the Jazz were one of the best, one of the teams that had the most of anyone in the league, and yet they just didn't have good shooters. And so I think the feeling was that they had to move into the era of a spread floor. The Jazz were the only team in the league that were playing two bigs, both of which could not dribble, pass, or shoot.
Mm-hmm.
And so under that circumstance, you're pretty limited. I think as much as they admire Derek Favors and what a professional he is, and also just what a great guy he has been to the program, I think it was just a clear statement that they needed to move on to become a more spread floor, to Donovan's benefit, frankly, to Rudy's benefit. Rudy shot 69% last year when not on the floor with Derek Favors. And so many people talked about Nikola Mirotic. He surprised everyone, went back to Europe. And then I think Boyan Bogdanovich was the next player, and maybe even the player before that, just a more expensive choice. And maybe not purely a four the way Mirotic was, but he was the next player on the board that had, and he's quite a player. I mean, his last 50 games of the year last year, I think it was, or maybe it was 30 games a year. He averaged 20 plus odd points and shot 50-40. I mean, this guy can really play, and he showed the ability last year to carry an offense after the injury to Victor Oladipo. So I think at that point, he's just the best player available. He kind of matches what they wanted to do. It was in the final 30 games of the year last year, 21 points, 4 rebounds, 2 assists, but more importantly, 51% from the field, 42% from three. And that's while being the go-to guy on an Indiana team that did not have a lot of other weapons.
I think what you bring up there is important as well. Yes, he was excellent during that time frame, had a sky-high usage, like 26% usage, but he still didn't crack the top 80 in fantasy, and that was while being that number one option. Now, he comes to Utah, he won't have to be that number one option, and we've seen him in the past. That first year in Indiana, he wasn't the number one option because Oladipo was doing so much. He was the 120th ranked player during that time. Now, he provides excellent value in terms of his efficiency from the field, from the free throw line. He shot 43% from three overall last season. That's massive. But just getting to the line with a larger volume, which he did last season, more when he had that role when Oladipo was out. He's shown in the past that if he's not that number one option, then he just doesn't get to the free throw line. He doesn't take advantage of that good free throw shooting, and he does lack in some of those other areas. So I think, to me, Bogdanovich, who did finish last season as a top 100 fantasy guy, it might be a little bit harder for him to get to that level just because of those other guys around him maintaining that 24% usage, 26% usage that he had down the stretch when Oladipo was out. That's probably going to be hard for him to do that. Now, do you think that he automatically comes in as a starter on this team?
I do. I think he's that quality. I mean, I think he's that level of a player. I think he is the starter. I think he starts probably as the power forward unless Royce O'Neal or Jeff Green ends up starting and Joe Ingles comes off the bench. And then he could slide down. I think that usage rate may not be as high, but I wouldn't be surprised if the Jazz don't build their rotation in a manner so that Bogdanovich is the lead guy on the second unit. It seems to me that's where he could be most useful as a former number one option, high usage player, to have him on the floor as the primary scorer on the second unit. So Donovan, even though Bogdanovich starts, you circle him out quickly. Donovan and Conley run that. And then maybe it's, either Donovan or Conley and Bogdanovich, or maybe it's some other combination, but it allows him to do his stuff. And if he can do that against second team guys, it'll be pretty impressive. One number I always like, Josh, is the Nylon Calculus made this up a while back. It's called the rule of 750. If you take a player's last 750 threes, that's a big enough sample size that you should be able to anticipate what's coming next. In the last 2 years, Bogdanovich took 386 threes. He actually took the same amount each of the last 2 years, strangely enough. And so that's about 772. It's a good vantage point to know what you're going to get from him. He made 41% of his threes each of the last 2 years, over that 2 year span. The Jazz just added a 40% three-point shooter to replace a 33% Jay Crowder and a 20-something% Derek Favors. That's quite something.
One thing that you mentioned there is interesting to me. I've seen it written in a few places. Tony Jones had it at The Athletic a few weeks back. The idea of perhaps starting Bogdanovich, which I think is going to happen, but bringing Joe Ingles off the bench and starting Royce O'Neal, which you mentioned there. Tony seems to think that's the way it's going to go. Maybe just reducing a little bit of Ingles' as workload as he gets a little bit further on in his career, and have him run the second unit offense in a different way to how Bogdanovich would do it as more of a creator. Do you think that is something? I've been saying that quite a bit on my show as a possibility, and everyone's been pushing back. No way Ingles is going to the bench. But is there a chance that's going to happen?
I think there is a chance it's going to happen, but I think it would be on Joe's terms. I think Joe Ingles has earned the right, to still start. And I'm a huge believer in starting your 5 best players. Joe would be in that group. But I don't expect that Joe Ingles plays 31 minutes a night as he did last year. I think that's too many. And so I think that you'll see it not because of Joe's performance in any way, but I think just for, at 32 years old, you need to drop his minutes and the burden on him. The other thing on Joe is, he was a primary ball handler in the second unit most of the year last year with Derek Favors in the pick and roll. I don't know whether he takes that role as much. And his 3-point, at times he was the second offensive option for the Jazz. He is now going to be the 5th offensive option for the Jazz in a lot of their lineups. And when that's the case, that's a different player and a different burden on Joe, and something that he should excel at. He's probably not a first or second option, but he certainly is a pretty darn good 5th option. And when you start getting into the corner 3 shooting and catch and shoot numbers, it gets pretty awesome.
Well, we talk about elite 3-point shooters for not including last season, but the 16-17 and 17-18 season, he was a 44% 3-point shooter. It did fall off last year down to 39, but that was more of a weird blip at the beginning of the year because, like Bogdanovich, at the end of the season, he got ridiculously hot and shot 44% over the final 2 months of the season and averaged over 7 assists per game in that time. But that was while playing 32 minutes a night. So I am in agreement with you that his minutes are going to come down this season. I think he's going to be taking on more of that second half playmaker type role more this year. And hopefully if that shooting can come back up, it's going to really help. Another weird thing is his free throw shooting really dropped off. I think there is a risk in terms of Ingles with fantasy getting maybe a little bit overdrafted, but it seems that the sites have sort of adjusted to perhaps a decline. ESPN's got him at 127, Yahoo's got him at 109. I think that's probably about right, whereas last season in that portion at the end of the year, he was like a top 60, top 70 type of a player with that increase in assists and as his shooting started to get hot. But there is definitely, I think there is a risk that we're going to see fewer minutes from Ingles and not that 31, 32 that he was playing last season. Let's go into the bigger names here. We'll start with Rudy Gobert, David, who obviously puts up what the numbers that he does consistently. Key player, defensive player of the year, underrated offensive guy, the 22nd ranked fantasy player last season. But the question that we have is we can look at Gobert and go, well, he averaged 16 and 13, 2.3 blocks, 67% shooting. That's all great. But what does he do different this year? What can he improve? What can he do more of this year?
Well, I think there's 2 things that will change. If he gets outside 3 feet, he shoots terribly. And will he be able to find some sort of move or something he can do if there's a defender between he and the basket? When against Milwaukee last year, Brook Lopez just dropped down there and Rudy couldn't quite get to the rim in the same way and didn't have as good a game. He's, an incredible roller, but he's got to find a way to be able to, when he catches the ball at 5 feet, have something. And he is not. I think he's been at 31% outside 3 feet the last few years. I think he's been at 29% the year before that, if I'm correct. Outside 3 feet last year, he shot 45 of 140.
Yeah, that's not
so.
Good.
If he can improve that at all, I think you've got a different player. I'll tell you what, I can write a pretty easy script where I get Rudy Gobert to 20 points a game. You start playing with the on-off numbers of Rudy Gobert on the floor or off the floor compared to Derek Favors. And when he's on the floor without Favors, his shooting percentage, he's played a lot of minutes every night with a crowded floor where Derek Favors' guy was not following Derek Favors to the corner. And so Rudy's rolling to the basket and Derek Favors' guy is running into him. Well, if the Jazz start the starting lineup that we just talked about and Rudy Gobert runs a pick and roll with Mike Conley and you have Donovan Mitchell lifted and you have Bogdanovich and Ingles in the corners, both those guys are nearly 50% corner 3 shooters, at least 45 depending on which corner they're on or they're in. You're not leaving Donovan Mitchell. You're not leaving Mike Conley. Rudy's rolling to the basket. He could have a field day in those circumstances. If you put Rudy's numbers last year to 36 minutes with Derek Favors off the floor, he shoots 69% from the field. He gets 15 rebounds and scores 18.5 points a game while taking 1 fewer shots per 36 minutes than he did when Favors was on the floor. So if you have Rudy playing 32 minutes a night, he suddenly goes and gets one or two more shots because the shooting's better, makes one more shot because he gets a little better outside 3 feet, Rudy Gobert becomes a 20-point-a-game scorer pretty quickly.
Over the final 15 games of last season, he did average 18 points and 13 rebounds. So I guess there is scope for him to get to that level. And getting there with Conley in terms of usage and just getting enough of those shots might be a little bit tough for him. But I do agree that the absence of favors does help him out. And maybe that addition of, replacing Rubio with Conley, which you'd think is an increase.
Wait. I got to jump in here. I think Ricky Rubio was not a good lob passer.
No, but he also he's going to take fewer shots than what Conley will.
Maybe, but I think Conley opens things up for Rudy. I mean,
that's true.
Rudy Gobert and Ricky Rubio run a pick and roll. You're going under that pick and roll and staying on Gobert.
Yeah. So
you go under a Mike Conley pick and roll, he's going to kill you.
So that could help in terms of efficiency. So, over the second half of last season, Gobert was pushing 70% from the field anyway. So that could be right up there, and that extra 2-3 percentage points on his field goal percentage could come from that spacing, from having Conley around, from having more offensive threats that do help him in that area. And that could push, even if it is a reduction in usage, that the efficiency pushes the scoring to the same level or even higher. And he will have fewer competition or less competition in terms of grabbing rebounds. Boyan Bogdanovich is not the same rebounder that Derek Favors is. So Gobert is going to be relied upon more on that end. So there is a chance he could actually be a better fantasy option this year than last year, despite the addition of Conley and his increased usage. So there is many things that can sort of change with how these guys set up. At the moment, his rank on ESPN is just way too high at number 13. He's never been that high of a player, but on Yahoo, about 22. That sounds about the right spot, second round guy. But one thing you do have to worry about are the free throws. He's not a good free throw shooter, and he takes a lot of them. So that's a big dent in your free throw percentage category, and you do have to really take that into account, just of how often he gets to the line, that it can be a significant impact on your overall team's free throw percentage. We've referenced him already, David. Let's talk a little bit more about Donovan Mitchell, who, heading into his third year now, it's a little bit of that situation.
By the way, I just want to give you a little note. Can I give you one little more note?
Yep.
Per 36 minutes, 36 is probably a lot, but not a lot for Rudy. Rudy Gobert on the floor with Donovan Mitchell and not Derek Favors last year. Okay?
Yep, Donovan Mitchell, no Favors.
19 points, 15 rebounds per 36 minutes.
Yeah.
69% from the field.
Yeah, I think those rebounds is what's going to be key, because he is going to have to... Boyan Bogdanovich is not a good rebounder, so he is going to have to grab a lot more of those, and I think that is a really key thing, that if he came out and was a top 2, top 3 rebounder in the league, I think, or top 2, him and Andre Drummond really challenging for that title, I think that is probably a more realistic scenario for Gobert this season.
Rudy, just keeps getting better and is obsessed with getting better. So I would suspect that continues. His free throw shooting did not get better for the first time in 3 years last year. You bring up a good point there. Yeah,
and he's just hovering in that mid-60s, and it got worse over the back end of the season as well. But
what's a good number of assists for a center?
Well, it depends. If you include in Nikola Jokic, then it's about 8. Otherwise, if you're looking at someone who gets 3 to 4, someone like Julius Randle is an above-average center in that area. 3 or 4 is probably a decent number for a center.
I think there's a chance he gets to 3 this year, because I think the only choice depending on the lineups, I think you're going to have to trap Conley.
Okay.
Right? I mean, just think about defensively. If you run a Conley-Gobert pick and roll, and you don't trap Conley, you're trailing, Gobert's rolling, Donovan's lifted, the corner 3 shooters we just talked about, I think you're dead. Maybe you're just dropping the big, in the way Portland does. But I think you're going to have to, teams are going to come out and trap Conley and trap Donovan off those pick and rolls to try to force Rudy to make a play in the middle of the floor. And that, I think, is something we'll see whether he can do it or not.
He did have a career high in assists last season, 2 assists per game. So he's got a little bit of a way to go. But again, that's making progress in that area. Donovan Mitchell, David, second season last season. A lot of people thought, it was a bit of a letdown maybe from Mitchell, mainly because he didn't I guess, take a huge, massive blow up, but he still was significantly better to me than his rookie season, averaged almost 4 additional points per game. But what did happen, especially early in the season, is the shooting wasn't quite there, but still, overall, he shot 36% from 3, better than his rookie season. He got to the line more as well. Now, we've talked about this in the past, I think on Locked On NBA last year, about how Mitchell's numbers improve when he plays as a point guard versus when he plays as a shooting guard. He's not going to have those opportunities to be playing as that point guard as often this season, so that could lead again to a situation where some of his numbers overall stagnate, but taking those steps forward. What are we looking at as an improvement from Mitchell? I think he's going to take a big step forward in his efficiency this season.
I got a bunch of takes here. One, anyone who thought that his last year was a letdown doesn't get it. Guys who have good rookie years very rarely take a jump. Okay, LeBron did, but just about nobody else who's ever had a good rookie year makes their jump in year 1 to year 2. They make their jump in year 2 to year 3. That's the progression that most players, when they really get a lot better, that's when it 2 to year 3. Donovan has to get more efficient. I think that's absolutely true. According to Basketball Reference last year, Donovan played 29% of his minutes at the point guard, 71% at the shooting guard. I think that number changes a little, but I'm not totally convinced of that. In the sense that depending what happens with Emmanuel Mudiay and Dante Exum, there's a chance that Donovan Mitchell plays backup point guard, and they split the minutes of Conley. If you think of Conley and Donovan playing the final 6 and the first 6 together, so they play 12 minutes together in a night, and Conley's only playing 30, then there's about 18 minutes for Donovan to go play backup point guard. I don't know that they totally split those two, but I think there's a chance that Donovan plays a decent amount without Mike Conley on the floor with the ball in his hands, depending a little bit on whether Mudiay or Exum show an ability to handle that themselves. That could change it if they're showing a propensity to be able to do that themselves.
Mitchell, from a fantasy point of view, people who had him on their teams last year be well aware that when he does play as that point guard, when Rubio was out and he was starting alongside Royce O'Neal in the backcourt, we saw those assist numbers rise. And more importantly, for a guy that's an 80+% free throw shooter, his free throw attempt rate would go through the roof, and that is a big influencer in terms of overall fantasy rank. So if he gets that job and is that backup point guard, that is really fantastic for his overall value. He's ranked at 30 on Yahoo, which I think is about right. He's 51 on ESPN, which of course isn't right. He's significantly better than that. But if he does start to, if he gets those assists up at 5.5, maybe 6, that's probably going a little bit too far, but that pushes him into the top 20 pretty comfortably. And I like him as a third round sort of a guy for this season. With, as you said, that second to third year, it's what I talk about all the time on this show, is that third year players, you get that big step forward, and Mitchell is now prime for that. More responsibility playing for Team USA now as well throughout the summer. Some big steps forward, hopefully coming for Donovan Mitchell. But the other guy we've danced around a bit here, David, is Mike Conley, coming across in that trade in the off-season. An unbelievably good player who's never been an all-star, much like Rudy Gobert on this squad. Conley slots in as the starter next to Mitchell. It is a different situation for Mike now versus what it's been like in Memphis for the last couple of seasons, and he was great last year, the 28th ranked player in fantasy, playing 34 minutes a night. I think it'll be a little bit of a drop-off for him this season just because the caliber of players he's playing with, Bogdanovich and Ingles and Mitchell and Gobert, meaning he doesn't have to have this 28-29% usage to be as effective, and that might drop him back from being that borderline second-round guy. But to me, he feels like a perfect fit on this squad.
So you understand this stuff way better than I do from a fantasy standpoint. What's most interesting to me about Mike Conley from a basketball standpoint is what you just said, but it's I'm viewing it a little bit differently. The guys he's played with on the wings, for the last few years, it's been Dylan Brooks, but maybe the best offensive player he ever played with was maybe a Rudy Gay for a little while. If it's not Rudy Gay, it's OJ Mayo.
Yep.
He has not played with guys that are wing scorers, or he's never played with a Donovan Mitchell at any point in his life. And you start going and digging into some of his numbers, and you see one of the best catch and shoot guys in the league. You see maybe the best open shooter in the league, or one of the best open shooters in the league. And I wonder how he's going to be used. You let Donovan make plays and kick to an open Mike Conley? Holy smokes, that's not something Mike Conley's ever done. Mike Conley catching a pass with an advantage on a weak side action. He's never done that before. He's created all of his own actions. He's in the 85th percentile last year of all spot-up shooting. Open shooting, according to Synergy last year, unguarded, he was in the 96th percentile. Well, that's not a great sample size. There wasn't a lot of them. It was only 1 year. You go back 2 years to his 17-18 season or 16-17 season when he's not injured, and it's the exact same numbers. This is one of the best shooters in the league. This is a guy who's never played with dynamic offensive talent around him, and he will for the first time. He was a 90 percentile spot-up shooter and from open shooting, according to Synergy, in that year. Prior, he was the same. As I mentioned before, he was in the 96th percentile, shooting an effective field goal percentage of 77%. So when Mike Conley is suddenly off the ball a little bit, getting some open looks, I have no idea what he might be, but he might be just fabulous.
I guess one concern that we have, or I have with Conley, is more just looking at the history of some players who have gone to Utah, in particular Ricky Rubio, who saw his assist rate drop pretty significantly playing under Quin Snyder and that ball sharing system where Mitchell's handling it, where Ingles is handling it, with a lot of other players taking that responsibility. Do you think that that is going to be an impact here for Conley, that because of the way that Snyder runs things, we are not going to see that ball in his hands quite as often?
Well, the track record, as you talked about, says that. Quinn believes in ball movement and passing. He sets the most picks and most handoffs in the league. He believes in obvious unselfishness. He believes in moving the basketball, and he believes strongly that the more you touch the ball offensively, the better you are defensively. So those principles would lead it, I think, a little bit less Mike Conley dominant in the way that was otherwise. But as I was just talking about, I think Conley will see those benefits in other areas.
The other guy that the potential to start is Royce O'Neal, who started at times at shooting guard last season when Rubio was hurt. He's probably going to be in line to play minutes at the 2, the 3, and the 4 this season. Entering the age of, he's just turned 26. I think we're going to see a larger role for O'Neal this season, but is he just going to be that guy? And this is how I sort of view O'Neal. It's just a guy that comes in and does what he needs to do, plays his strong defense, provides some okay floor spacing, but not going to be a guy that's touching the ball a lot and doing a lot in terms of box score contributions.
I would think that the reason you would play Royce O'Neal, toughness, defense, a bunch of things, but also one of them is his lack of usage rate. That If you suddenly have Mike Conley and you have these other guys, then maybe you actually don't want him out there. You don't want Joe Ingles using the ball quite as much or things of that sort. And so with that understood, I think that would be the role for Royce O'Neal. To Royce O'Neal's credit, when it became the playoffs and a lot of other guys wilted, he didn't. And that earned an awful lot of respect. He seemed to get better as the playoffs happened last year and the bigger the moments were, and showed an ability, fearlessness to kind of match up to that moment. I think that earned him a lot of respect in the Jazz organization, and why there's an expectation of him taking a larger role. And frankly, he shot it pretty well. After he started working with Kyle Korver last year, his shooting got a lot better, and then he had a really poor stretch right around after the All-Star break. And so it's a little hard to tell where he ranks in that regards and what which shooter he probably is, whether it's the first half shooter or the second half shooter. He's not a natural shooter. I don't think he's a high volume shooter. So to your point, I would say yes. While he may have an increased role, he went from 17 minutes to 20, maybe he goes to 25. I don't know that he increases his usage a great deal.
Yeah, that's exactly how I see it with O'Neal. I think he'll have a really, really small usage, even depending if he starts or comes off the bench. It doesn't really matter. He'll be just that sort of a guy. We had Derek Favors be the backup center for so many years here in Utah, as well as the starting power forward, but now we've got a new guy in town. Ed Davis is most likely going to be the backup center, but David, we also had Tony Bradley put together some pretty big performances through Summer League and looked like he was too good to be there, which is an encouraging sign. So is it Davis who's locked in now as that backup center, or do you think Bradley could give it a shake?
I'd be pretty surprised if Tony Bradley beat out Ed Davis. Those are Ed Davis minutes. I think they know exactly what they're getting out of Ed Davis. They're pretty excited to have Ed Davis and particularly his defensive prowess. He was the second best defensive plus-minus player in the league last year behind Rudy Gobert. So I think they're particularly excited in that regard to have him. So I would be stunned if in any way Tony Bradley stole minutes from Ed Davis.
Ed Davis is also one of the best rebounders in the NBA, and if you need rebounds at any point to stream in, he is a guy that can come in 18 minutes and actually grab 8 or 9 boards in that small amount of time. That's how good he is on the boards. He's not going to contribute too much else, but defensively he's strong, but it's those rebounds and high efficiency finishing as well from Ed Davis that does provide that value. They also brought in Jeff Green this year. David, I guess this is just to play a backup role behind whatever happens at power forward, whether that is Bogdanovich or Royce O'Neal. And Green had a little bit of a resurgence last season in Washington, played some of the best ball of his last 5 seasons or so. But it's more just of an emergency. I've seen it posited around that Jeff Green's going to start on this team over Bogdanovich, which is insane to me, and that's just not going to happen. But he's just going to be that backup guy who provides solid value in the forward spots.
I mean, I think I wouldn't be surprised if the Jazz do some intermixing with their starters, kind of a la Nick Nurse in Toronto last year, depending, when you're playing Portland, are you going to decide to have Jeff Green match up and guard LaMarcus Aldridge or Rudy Gobert, depending, I guess that I'm thinking of when they played 2 bigs, but if they're playing Jakob Poeltl. Are you doing that, or are you playing Boyan Bogdanovich and trying to make Aldridge chase him all around the floor? I mean, the thing on Bogdanovich, I don't think a lot of people realize, and frankly, I didn't until I started going back and watching a lot of his tapes, is, Indiana used him almost Klay Thompson-esque at times. So he's running off picks and doing all sorts of things. And what happens, in that regard is, can you have LaMarcus Aldridge trying to guard that? So how do you take advantage, or do you start Jeff Green so that you actually have a body that's big enough to handle it?
Yeah, look, he provides value across many different areas, Green. I don't think you'd want to, if you're going by what you said earlier about, start your 5 best players, Green's not one of those, so he's not going to come into consideration in that area. But he did provide solid enough value. He's just not a very good fantasy player because he has lack of defensive stats. He doesn't get assists. He just doesn't contribute really well in any one category, even though it was a big step forward for him last season. We're getting down to the back end of the roster now. Emmanuel Mudiay played minutes last season in New York. I'd say he was improved, but that's going from a very, very low place from where he was before. Do the Jazz have trust in him that he can be that backup guy? Or as you said earlier, they just want to put Mitchell into that position and that leaves Mudiay on the outside?
I think they're hoping that maybe Emmanuel Mudiay learned something last year. He did have an uptick in New York. He played a very different game prior to his ankle injury. He was one of the best overall pick and roll players in the NBA for a short period of time there. So I think they're hoping that he is growing up a little bit, that they can develop him, that they can find a way to use him, and that he will be able to be that backup point guard. I don't think they signed him to play him. That's the intention.
He played 27 minutes a night last year and only averaged 4 assists, which is the starting point guard is pretty low. But he did post the best true shooting of his career. Again, not saying much considering his previous 3 seasons he'd been under 50% true shooting, which is a terrible mark. But he did improve that, which you have to give him credit for. But no defensive stats, low volume threes, and he's only going to be a very marginal contributor this season. Do you think that someone like George Niang can be an every night rotation player?
I don't know if they need him to be, but I think he's shown the ability to shoot well enough that he could be, if that's what you're asking.
Yeah, so I think if they hadn't have brought Jeff Green in, he would have been in that role. They don't have too many power forwards on this team, especially when you're considering starting Bogdanovich or O'Neal in that spot. So there is, I guess, some role there, but I think Green probably nullifies what Niang can do this season. And then lastly, David, before we get out of here, the Jazz had a multitude of second-round picks. We had Justin Wright-Foreman, we had Jarrell Brantley and Mia Oni all come in. They also brought in a second-round pick that they drafted a few years ago, Nigel Williams-Goss. Are we just going to be seeing those guys mainly play for the Salt Lake Stars?
I think Nigel Williams-Goss will be on the roster as your third point guard. I think Mia Oni will get some time. But I do not suspect that I do not suspect that they're, fantasy guys that anybody would want to get, but I know nothing about fantasy, so I'm useless when I make that comment, but that's my thought.
Yeah, no, well, you're right on the money there. Those guys aren't going to be playing huge amounts, but I think a guy like Williams Goss would be interesting if Exum was hurt and he has to be forced into some extra minutes in that situation, although you'd probably just go with more of Mitchell running things there. But he would be an interesting guy, a little bit older, about to turn 25 years of age and had some success over in Europe for the last couple of seasons. That'll wrap it up for us here, David, with the Utah Jazz preview for this season. A couple of new faces in there and seeing how that all works out. Locked On Jazz, you're hosting that over there, and of course Locked On NBA, and everyone can go and check that out. So thank you for jumping on once again to preview the Utah Jazz.
My pleasure. Enjoyed it.
All right, that does it for today's show. Apologies for the video feed problems. There was issues with the lighting. Things were jumping all over the place. I tried to fix them and they kept screwing up, but eventually got it back on track after the interview is over. So I apologize for that weird visual effect that you guys were seeing on the screen. Make sure you are subscribed to me. YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and on Spotify. And give it a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts. That would be great. On YouTube, give it a thumbs up, subscribe, leave a comment. You know the drill. Check out the rest of the podcasts right across the Locked On Podcast Network. But most importantly, check out the team preview shows that I've been doing as well here on Locked On Fantasy Basketball. Guys, we are done here. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. See ya. George Niang.